So one of the first people you met, I believe, on that scene was Jack Hardy. And we're honored to have Jack's daughter, Miranda, here with us. So please, fill us in a little bit on Jack.
You mean between 1982 and 2026?
His real name is John Studebaker Hardy.
Well, that's the secret, the big secret. John Studebaker Hardy from South Bend, Indiana. He had a lot of different personalities. We like to joke that if anybody else could do an Eras tour, it would be Jack Hardy. He had his Western era, growing up in Summers in Colorado. He had his Celtic era. He lived in Ireland for a short period of time in the 70s. And then he went hard into his labor union American political era. One of my favorite eras. He was a big history buff and opinionated, I'll say, about American politics.
Also the first person ever arrested for libel on the president.
So many fun facts, David. That is true. The only person to be convicted of libeling the president, and it was overturned, Nixon. He was the editor of a magazine on his college campus, and as I understand it, it was a lewd cartoon. I don't know. Malcolm? Anywhere? Bueller? It was a middle finger, and the middle finger was a penis. I'm here. So that was the kind of person he was, unapologetically funny and opinionated about our leaders, and he held them accountable with his songwriting.
And he moved here in the mid-70s and became kind of the overlord of this scene in a way.
He used to say that he's like the least famous person with a box set. Him becoming kind of the nucleus of the clan and the village, I think was really just coming from his belief in the art of songwriting rather than the industry of it. And I think that inspired a lot of people and grounded them in their arts. It's hard, especially these days, to remind yourself that songwriting is an art. A lot of people are like, oh, well, would this be a hit? And we kind of forget that it is a human expression art form, so.
Would you like to do one of his songs?
I was planning on it, and it's funny, when I was thinking about what song I wanted to play for you guys, there is a song called I Oughta Know, and I was like, oh, man, I really want to play this song, and my partner Charlie was like, I don't know, there are a lot of references in that song people don't get, and I was like, I think that's the point of the song. So this is going to be I Oughta Know. It is a political song, so I'm sorry, you're welcome. I say it's political, but it's really just an American history lesson. I oughta know more than I know. I oughta know where this road goes. I oughta know great literature by heart, the history of art. This I oughta know. I oughta know more than 1492. I oughta know what the Buffalo Bills do. I oughta know more than the quarterbacks wounded me, what happened at Sand Creek. This I oughta know, but I don't. I oughta know about the sacrifices made. I oughta know ration stamps, air raids. I oughta know more than George C. Scott and John Wayne gets shot. This I oughta know. I oughta know what the drinking board means. I oughta know more than I have a dream. I oughta know about the back of the bus and the crockabilly clubs. This I oughta know, but I don't. Marx and Hegel. I oughta know about the Haymarket hangings and the HUAC. Yes, I oughta know. I oughta know about Oliver Cromwell. I oughta know about the Gnostics and St. Paul. I oughta know what Jesus really said and who the preacher takes to bed. Yes, I oughta know, but I don't. I oughta know what's buried in the landfill. I oughta know about clear cutting bills. I ought to know about pipelines and schemes, what extinction really means. 'Cause I ought to know for whom the bell tolls. I ought to know about the pride and prejudice of polls. I ought to know if the grapes are rather union picked by Victor Hara's hands. 'Cause I ought to know, but I don't. I don't know nothing about nothing, but I'm practiced and bred. I don't know nothing about nothing, but my future looks so bright, illumined by the lights, laugh track, sound bites, no replay to get it right. I ought to know. Jack was a very interesting father. He decided when he had kids that that was his backtrack for his concerts. With no practice, he would bring us out on stage and we would sing with him. I'm not sure it was any good, but at the time I thought we were great. And I don't really think I knew what I was singing lyrically, so it's been fun to grow older and listen to his stuff and be like, oh, that's what he meant.